back, everyone, and here we go there we are. Okay, so today, let me get this going how we want it. Let's see. And there we are. Okay, great. So today what we're going to be looking at is the continuing developments and further intensification of the Cold War, moving further into the 1950s, and particularly under the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower. So we've talked before about how the Cold War is just the cornerstone of American foreign policy for the next several decades. And this policy of containment is part of it as well. And I've mentioned that every presidential administration from Truman to Reagan, or really maybe even to the first President Bush, really more Reagan, has some form of a containment policy. That is what they're all trying to do, is to contain the Soviet Union, contain the threat of Soviet communism. It is a question of how they go about doing that and how that actually works out for them in the end. So today we're going to look at this continuing Cold War and talk about some of the policies of the Eisenhower administration, their rhetoric, and how that was significantly different than his predecessor Truman, and also how that actually worked out on the global stage, and how American and Soviet relationships continued to intensify, and we continue to see even armed conflict and some more tense situations, proxy wars and things like that, how some of those start to develop. So President Eisenhower, we've looked at his domestic policy a little bit. We know that Eisenhower, I'm sure you recognize Eisenhower as having been the supreme Allied commander in World War II. So he was quite the war hero and really just had a squeaky clean record, a spotless reputation amongst a lot of Americans. And as a general, probably seemed to many to be an ideal person to lead the United States in this Cold War. And so we're going to take a look at his bit more, at least philosophically aggressive approach to the Cold War, but how also that much more ideologically and philosophically aggressive policy or rhetoric was often really quite unrealistic, or perhaps maybe even dangerous by some standards. So let's take a look at that. We see a much bolder Cold War policy, a much bolder containment policy coming from the Eisenhower administration, much more confrontational rhetoric. But what that's going to do, it's kind of intended to be more confrontational, more heavy, more in your face, meant to really be kind of a deterrent to communist aggression. But what it ends up doing is really not, of course, not ending the Cold War, but really forcing the United States into more global commitments, more, committing forces, committing resources to more parts of the world, to other places, to the third world, and so forth, to satisfy and to live up to that ever-widening global commitment to resist the Soviets at every turn, to resist communism. And in the end turns out to be practically, kind of unrealistic and rather costly. The mastermind behind this more bold foreign policy, this more bold rhetoric, is John Foster Dulles, who was Eisenhower's Secretary of State. And so we call this form of this foreign policy, this idea, this rhetoric, Dulles diplomacy, since he is the one that kind of came up with it and becomes the voice of it. Of course, Eisenhower owns it, but Dulles is really the one that's kind of behind it all and advises Eisenhower in this whole thing. Dulles diplomacy, or John Foster Dulles himself, believed that the United States really had a destiny to lead the world. And so he kind of wants to take the United States' position in the world beyond just containing communism where it exists. In fact, one of the principles of Dulles diplomacy is that containing communism wasn't enough. Keeping it where it was not enough. That was actually immoral. That was passive. That was the United States giving in. He wants to see the United States do far more than that. So instead of just containing communism, Dulles diplomacy calls for rolling back communist gains, from actually liberating people from communism, freeing people from communism, but not with military means. So you can see how that's a little bit perhaps confusing as to how exactly do we do that, but to do that with non-military strategies, to basically, make things, kind of find other ways to convince other countries that communism wasn't the way, that democracy and capitalism was the way, to sort of lead by example so that people would see the United States as kind of a, shining light. We want to be like them. So the way that this whole Dulles diplomacy is framed, another way that we can articulate this particular policy is what's called the New Look strategy. So Dulles diplomacy becomes this so-called New Look strategy of how they're going to handle the Cold War, how they're going to go about containment, and how they're actually going to go about going past containment to literally rolling back those communist gains. And so this New Look strategy, again, includes the threat of massive retaliation, which means exactly what it sounds like, using the threat of nuclear warfare to prevent communist aggression. So that's how Dulles wants to go about this whole thing, that we threaten that if there is any issue, if there is any assumed threat to the United States, that we take this line, that we are going to use everything that we've got. So sort of you stick a toe out of line, and we're going to come at you with all of our nuclear weapons and everything. So it's not just going to be a small isolated response. You're going to see a massive response. So the idea here was that this would deter communist aggression, that this would prevent any communist aggression because they wouldn't want, knowing that the United States was going to retaliate with full force, that they wouldn't try anything. And this was also meant to be a cost-saving measure, because the idea was you could focus on those nuclear weapons and not on keeping a larger standing army. So you could actually cut the size of the military and actually cut military spending in some areas so that you could use this massive retaliation policy while also cutting military spending. So this would be a little bit less expensive. So spend the money on the weapons delivery systems, spend money on the nukes, and not on actual soldiers and conventional weapons and those kinds of things. What this ends up, of course, doing is just intensifying the arms race with the Soviet Union. We talked about previously that the Soviets developed nuclear weapons in 1949, and so this just further initiates and further develops that ongoing arms race, nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union, as both the United States and the Soviet Union are just for the next several decades just trying to catch up with each other, just one after the other, building up large amounts of nuclear weapons. And the whole idea of being able to liberate, free people from communism is really something that the United States could not really practically do without military intervention and without causing serious chaos. So that ends up being really more of an idealistic part of it than a practical one. Another way we can look at this, another thing that this whole policy is called, is brinksmanship. This idea of threatening nuclear war, of being on the brink of nuclear war at all times. This is known as brinksmanship. And so another way to describe Dulles diplomacy or the New Look policy is with this term brinksmanship. It's this all or nothing strategy of we go all in or we don't do anything at all. And then again, that could be, kind of inspiring for some people. It can be kind of motivating. The hope is that will be a deterrent. But the other side of this is that it's not very practical, for one thing. Particularly with the Soviet Union having nuclear capability as well. As you can probably guess, most people realized, including the United States' enemies or rivals, clearly realized that the reality of this actually being utilized wasn't all that great. Because if the United States deploys nuclear force at this point, that means the Soviet Union is going to deploy nuclear force as well, which means everybody gets killed, everybody gets destroyed. We really have here what is sometimes known as MAD, or MAD, for mutually assured destruction. So with the amount of nuclear weapons that exist on both sides at this point, it really is kind of an impractical policy, because it's one of those things that if you were to order this used or employed, you're pretty much ordering your own destruction, because you can be sure that the Soviets are going to retaliate. So brinksmanship, it has its supporters, but there's also a lot of detractors that saw this as impractical, not realistic, and reckless, that this was scary, that this was just, there was no way this was ever going to work. There was no way it would ever be used. And that America's allies knew that. They know the United States can threaten and talk all they want, but there's no way they're actually going to do it. It's kind of like, when the teacher says, if one more person talks, I'm going to give the whole class detention. Well, maybe they're serious, but a lot of people in the class would probably go, they're not really going to do that. They can't really do that. And so they just continue doing on what they're doing. Brinksmanship is a little bit like that. So in the end, it ends up being not incredibly credible, and again, not very realistic in the long run. But that is at least the line, the rhetoric, the policy that they are at least proclaiming to be utilizing in the Eisenhower administration. Well, we are going to see not so much massive nuclear retaliation against the Soviet Union, but we are going to see under the Eisenhower administration, the United States being involved in several operations in what we would call the third world, which means lesser developed countries, lesser developed parts of the world. And this is where, if you remember at the end of World War II, talked about how the United States, before World War II, every conflict the United States had to do with Europe. They were either, they revolved around European countries and European interests. That was really kind of the center of the world, as it were. But after World War II, the United States' foreign interests have more to do with countries in Asia, countries in the Middle East, those sorts of things. And that happens largely because of containment, because of the Cold War, and because in the years following World War II, you're going to see a collapse. And this is bringing in some world history stuff that perhaps you remember from several years ago. But in the wake of World War II, all those colonial empires of Britain and France and several other European powers where they had colonized, almost all of Africa and India and parts of Asia and the South Pacific and places like that, all of those empires start to collapse, and you start to see independence movements throughout Africa and places like that. Well, that leads to instability. That leads to instability and chaos with the collapse of those colonial governments. And in the absence of that, that becomes kind of those countries that are trying to get on their feet and are shaking off the imperial powers of Britain and France and whoever, oftentimes we're going to need assistance. And so that created this place for either the United States or the Soviet Union to swoop in and try to provide that help. It made this situation where, okay, these countries are gaining independence and there's chaos and there's instability. Is the United States going to, swoop in to make sure that those countries develop governments that are friendly to the United States? Or is the Soviet Union going to do that to make sure that those governments are communist and are friendly to the Soviet Union? So the third world becomes another place where the Cold War breaks out, where the Cold War is really fought, and why we actually see these proxy wars taking place, because both the Soviet Union and the United States want to make sure that new governments in this third world are friendly to them. There are several examples of that, and several examples of the United States getting involved in covert operations in order to ensure that governments in certain parts of the world were loyal and friendly to the United States. Covert meaning that it's all underground, that it's not, an official action. This is all like secretive, CIA kind of stuff, CIA operations for overthrows, coups, stuff that is in the grand scheme of things, according to the rules of war, not exactly legal, but stuff that actually happens. There are multiple examples of this. One of the ones I want to talk about is in Iran. Iran, of course, in the Middle East. So again, there's multiple operations in the wake of post-war colonialism to make sure that pro-Western, pro-American governments stay in power. And that happens in Iran, of course, in the Middle East, which the United States had a huge interest in because of oil. The Middle East is of big interest now to both the United States and the Soviet Union because of the oil there. And we talked about, the car culture and automobiles taking a really important place in the United States, motor culture. And so oil was incredibly important, as well as powering, military equipment and all that sort of thing. So the previous government, Iran, was not exactly friendly to the United States. And so the United States organized a CIA operation, that's the Central Intelligence Agency, basically the spy agency, one of the United States' intelligence agencies, organized an overthrow of that government. So a covert operation to, maybe illegally is the word you want to use. Perhaps that's too strong of a word. Depends on your point of view, I suppose. Overthrow that government and install instead as the leader of Iran, the Shah of Iran. So the Shah of Iran is the leader of Iran that was pretty much put in place or brought into power by this covert action of the United States. So the Shah of Iran was friendly to the United States, supported by the United States, and was a friendly government to the United States. So for the next several decades, the United States has a pretty good relationship with Iran because, the Shah of Iran was basically kind of a puppet almost of the United States and put in place intentionally by an American action. Keep that in mind because that's something we're going to look at in a couple of weeks when we get to the 1970s when the Shah of Iran is overthrown. And this leads to the now very, very bad relationship between the United States and Iran. This is part of the reason, if you're wondering why does Iran not like the United States very much, it's because of things like this, because of this meddling and getting involved in these kind of operations to make sure that Iran, stayed our little buddy. We see other actions like this happening in Guatemala and a few other places, and there's several other incidents that took place in the third world, and particularly in the Middle East, that made the Middle East a particularly volatile area and something that the United States had a vested interest in. This eventually leads to another kind of articulation of Eisenhower's foreign policy, something called the Eisenhower Doctrine. We had the Truman Doctrine, and now we have the Eisenhower Doctrine. The Eisenhower Doctrine isn't all that different from the Truman Doctrine, but it does specifically refer to the Middle East. So the Eisenhower Doctrine was basically the idea that the United States would extend military and economic help to Arab nations, to the Middle East. It specifically focuses on the Middle East and says that the United States is going to assist Middle Eastern countries in making sure that they fight off communism, ensuring that those places do not go communist. Again, this is because the United States now realizes that the Middle East is of vital importance to them because of that oil interest. The thing is that the Eisenhower Doctrine and this whole, the United States is going to help fight communism in the Middle East, ends up not really being that relevant, because really what becomes the enemy in the Middle East is not communism, or what becomes, enemy is not the right word. The threat to the United States, the concern for the United States in the Middle East is not communism, but nationalism. It is countries like Iran, countries like Egypt that say, we don't want to be controlled by the United States. We don't want to be controlled by the Soviet Union. We don't want either of you. We're going to be controlled by ourselves. Again, that's nationalism, saying Egypt is going to be controlled by Egyptians. We are going to make our own decisions. Iran's going to be controlled by Iranians, and we don't want to have anything to do with you. That really becomes the threat. There was a situation in Egypt with the Suez Canal that the United States was not involved in, but caused a lot of problems. But that heightened nationalism is really what is going to derail a lot of American interests and cause a lot of problems and lead to a lot of instability in the Middle East. That's eventually going to cause, the overthrow of that Shah of Iran when we get to the 1970s. Another example of the nationalism in the Middle East and how that was affecting the United States is we see in 1960 the formation of what is known as OPEC. You may have heard of OPEC before in the news. OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. That's the OPEC, and it includes multiple Middle Eastern nations. And it also includes Venezuela. Venezuela is the only one in the OPEC organization that is not in the Middle East. But these are largely petroleum-rich countries, oil-rich countries that form OPEC. OPEC is basically, it's a cartel is what it is, or oligopoly. It is, sort of think of it as almost like a monopoly, but not quite. But anyway, they are controlling, what they do is they are the ones that supply a lot of the world's oil and therefore have a great deal of control over it. So when people talk about OPEC today, they're talking about the price of oil and how OPEC is going to raise the price of a barrel of oil or lower the price of a barrel of oil and all of that. And the United States and several other Western democracies were becoming dependent at this time on OPEC, dependent on foreign oil. And particularly as nationalism took shape in those places, they can no longer control it themselves. And so pretty much at the mercy of OPEC. So that's just an example of how nationalism in the Middle East, in this case also Venezuela, was affecting the United States and other Western countries as well. We'll continue. I'm going to divide this into two sections here. So next time we're going to continue looking at other places in the third world where the United States has a developing interest. Particularly, we'll look in just a moment at Vietnam. So we'll be back in a little bit talking about the background to the United States' intervention and involvement in Vietnam.